I was ready.
Nice. We might take more probably later as we on topics as we cover them, certain topic. But always we start with just a brief um, contemplation um, related to our motivation for studying, for like from a Buddhist perspective, right? Actually, karma is determined, or karma is actually our motivation, and the action done by it is, but it's all under the influence of our motivation. Anyway, purpose for studying this particular kind of teaching, right, by Maitreya. It's a Mahayana teaching, so the key point is that our motivation should be like try to cultivate a motivation in accordance with Mahayana, which means we base it on love and compassion and bodhicitta. Just like in brief, we can actually contemplate that right now we have this precious human life. With freedom, opportunity, practice dharma, which is extremely rare. It doesn't last long. So, and which means, so we have this very precious human life, but when we die, we will die. We will die at any point. Between now and whenever we pass away, what's worth doing? What has value? So if we think of it in those terms, then like actually doing anything, studying Dharma, actually doing anything without love in our hearts, without compassion in our hearts, it's like a great loss. I feel like, I want to make the best use of this life, which means this moment. And start with love, but wishing all beings to have happiness. Includes yourself, also friends, strangers, enemies. As those beings don't actually, most beings, all ordinary beings actually don't have pure happiness. Many have a great deal of suffering. It's recognizing that suffering gives rise to compassion, the wish to free all those beings from suffering and its causes. Just take a moment to actually try to cultivate that experience or feeling of compassion, wishing to free ourselves and all others from suffering and its causes. Because it's actually true, isn't it? That just like we ourselves find suffering unbearable, so do all others. We're all the same in that way. Whether it's beings human or non-human, they don't want to suffer. So, animal, dogs and cats and various kinds of wild animals. And we're all the same and not wanting to suffer. May beings be free from suffering and its causes. I myself will free them from suffering and its causes. Right now, I don't have that ability to free beings from suffering and the causes of suffering. So may I progress on the path and become a Buddha in order to free beings from suffering and the causes of suffering. Just take a moment to cultivate that kind of motivation. Right? So wishing, that's bodhicitta, right? Wishing for enlightenment, Buddhahood, in order to free essentially beings from suffering and the causes of suffering. With that kind of feeling and thought, just I'll slowly say the verse once, like refuge and bodhicitta, and contemplate the meaning in this context. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of generosity, the other perfection, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Mm-hmm. So we'll do a little more contemplation later. Um, okay, so we're starting um, to study the chapter 4 of the, in English is translated as the Ornament for Clear Realizations, in Sanskrit it's the Abhisamaya Alankara. And I'll say a couple of things like the Abhisamaya Alankara itself is a humongous text that's studied by all the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism quite extensively, and I think like I was thinking about it in the some of my friends who are monks who study, you study it as part of the curriculum at the great monasteries. And so like I think that it's varied over the years depending on which monastery. It's changed since they left Tibet, but I think it's between 5 and 7 years they study it full time. So I was like thinking the full text of the Abhisamaya, all the monks do that. They're progressing in their studies. And so I was thinking about like that. It's a very big topic, that gets studied a lot in the monastery, and for good reason. It's an important text. And I was trying to say also in that context that I was sort of saying last night, I was thinking like, for me, I didn't study it for 7 years. I studied it some, so my own understanding is so great compared to monks have done. It's not, I haven't studied the full text very extensively, but I studied parts of it quite in depth. So, and the part we're studying, I studied more than the other parts. It's a big text. But and one thing I'll also say, just by way of introduction, and I want to try to do this a little bit today, is I'm conscious of something, which is the Abhisamayal Alamkara. Well, maybe I'll give an orientation first. So the Abhisamayal Alamkara is one of the 5 treatises composed by Maitreya, and the statue of Maitreya here at the center. And so it's one of the 5 treatises that he is said to have composed. And it's a commentary on the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And so there are many, actually, we studied the Heart Sutra once as part of the basic program. That's that one of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. But there are many Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and the 3 main ones, they call them the 3 mothers. They say the Prajnaparamita is the mother of all the Buddhas. Actually, and sometimes they say the Prajnaparamita is the mother in the sense that she is, is the mother of 4 kinds of children: the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, the hearers, and the Prajna Buddhas, because they all are born from the wisdom, the perfection of wisdom. You don't become any of the kinds of beings if you don't realize the perfection of wisdom. And then in terms of the perfection of wisdom, Prajnaparamita, can refer to an experience of wisdom, a certain kind of wisdom that let's talk about. And it can also refer to a set of texts that explain the practice of that kind of wisdom. So the term Prajnaparamita can have different, it refers to texts, but it also refers to the experience of that. And so on, which is one of the 6 perfections, Prajnaparamita, by the way. When you study the 6, giving and the other perfections, one of the 6 perfections is Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. So that's not a text, and I think it's a practice. It's something to do. But it can also refer to the text taught by the Buddha. And then there are said to be 3 main, there are many Prajnaparamita texts or sutras, right? Sutra means a text spoken by the Buddha. And I don't remember this later, but I'll say there are 3. They sometimes say there are 3 main, most important ones. I think there are at least 2 of them are in English. I'm not sure. There's one that's 100,000 verse Prajnaparamita. Then there's a 20,000 verse, and there's an 8,000 verse Prajnaparamita. And then there are shorter ones like the Heart Sutra and also the Vajrakata Sutra, which is very famous. But if you're going to study like the longer, the more extensive ones, then it's funny, the 8,000 verses like about that thick, and that's the shorter of those 3. Then there's 100,000 verses, quite extensive. And if you read the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, which is wonderful to do, they're beautiful texts to read, actually, but they're not easy to understand, of course. So I'm getting to this text. So then it's said that there's the explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras and the hidden meaning. And so the explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras was explained, is said to have particularly explained, you could say, by Nagarjuna. So Nagarjuna, in his treatises on wisdom, on reasoning, on emptiness, explains the explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and that is emptiness. Because the main topic of those sutras is emptiness. So Nagarjuna kind of very clearly explained that explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And then, his tradition, they call it the Arya tradition of father and sons, because these, like he explained that, and then Arya Deva, who was his direct disciple, wrote further commentaries. So they wrote like, and then Shakyamuni and other great teachers in the tradition explicating emptiness. Did a beautiful job explaining the explicit meaning. But then there's a hidden meaning for the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and Nagarjuna didn't emphasize that, so his disciples didn't emphasize that. So then it said that Maitreya in the Abhisamayalankara, in particular in his teachings, his 5 treatises, but especially in the Abhisamayalankara, explains in detail the hidden meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And so that's what this text is about. And so what does that mean? So the explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita Sutras is emptiness. And like, for example, in the Heart Sutra, where it says no eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, that's getting at no intrinsic existence, right? No inherent existence. It's empty. But then what is this hidden meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras? And that is that as a person, a bodhisattva, practices perfection of wisdom, they make progress through stages on a path to enlightenment. And what those stages are, the details of how a bodhisattva, and any actually, particularly a bodhisattva, but anybody who's progressing, even the other paths too, what paths of individual liberation of the cures, the path of individual liberation of the Prachika Buddhas, and then the main ones, the paths that are traveled by the bodhisattvas. So what happens, right, as a bodhisattva practices, is they make gradual progress towards Buddhahood. And hidden within the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras is the explanation of how bodhisattvas progress along those paths and the different experiences they have, the different levels of experience they have as they progress. And Maitreya, in his commentary, the Abhisamayalankara, explains what all those levels, in great detail, all these different levels and experiences that one has as one progresses. So you remember, so the bodhisattvas, right? Ordinarily, a bodhisattva, like Shakyamuni Buddha, there are different lengths of time that a bodhisattva takes to progress, just from the time they first begin the path until they become a fully enlightened Buddha. And it's said that Shakyamuni Buddha took 3 countless great eons. So it's explaining what were the levels that Shakyamuni Buddha went through as he first was a bodhisattva and then progressed towards Buddhahood over those eons of time. So it's a very extensive subject. Then that makes sense. And so the Abhisamayalankara explains that. And then I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but I'll just say briefly. So overall, the Abhisamayalankara has 8 chapters or 8 categories, 8 main categories, as they're called. And the first 3, I'll call them chapters, but they're really kind of categories. And then actually within those 8, I won't say topics because there are 8 categories and then there are 70 topics within the categories, which actually there's an FPMT's one of the supplementary. It's not, it's like a supplementary topic in the basic program. It's the 70 topics, which we won't cover because for the people, I'm not best to teach it, but we'll cover the 8, we'll describe a little bit the 8 categories now. So the first category is the exalted knower of all aspects. And the exalted knower of all aspects, so the first 3 are the 3 exalted knowers. So the exalted knower of all aspects, the exalted, the knower of the paths, and knower of the basics. So what do those 3 refer to? The first one, the exalted knower of all aspects, is interesting. The text begins with the end, because the exalted knower of all aspects is the mind of a Buddha. Right, so it begins with the goal, which is, and of the 70 topics, that covers 10 topics on it. So the first category of the first chapter covers the exalted knower of all aspects, which is describing qualities of the Buddha that you're aiming for. Then the next knower, the chapter 2, I'll call it, is the knower of the paths. And that's covered 11 topics, but that covers the experiences or the paths of the bodhisattva as they progress towards that goal. And then the third, the knower of the bases, it's 9 topics, but that one is the experiences of people who are seeking individual liberation. So the arhats and Prachika Buddhas, what they go through. I'll say a few things about these 3 exalted knowers, just because I'm kind of giving an orientation, if that makes sense. So just to the text, because I'm so explain why we're going to cover chapter 4. So these are the first 3 chapters. That makes sense. They're leading up to chapter. Uh, and so one point I'll make is, this is a text for bodhisattvas, so why does it cover no of the bases? Right? Why does it cover the paths of people seeking just their own liberation? At one point, actually, you make sense from Shay when he's telling this, he said, uh, bodhisattvas' purpose is to benefit all sentient beings, so they have to know all the paths, and they have to experience all the paths to some extent in order to be able to teach others them, right? And so, the main training of a bodhisattva is the knower of the paths, right, leading to which is the bodhisattva trainings, leading to the exalted knower of all aspects, the Buddhahood. But the bodhisattva must practice actually the knower of the bases, the practices of person seeking individual liberation, because they have to experientially be able to teach it to those for whom that's the suited path, right? So they have to, so that you can get a sense of now, first of all, why does it take eons for eons for that bodhisattvas kind of travel through all the different ways and paths of progressing to various kinds of enlightenment, so that it's not just intellectual for them, but so they can actually explain it and teach others well how to progress in those paths. And then when Kenshin Rishi was explaining, and I also there another point I'll make is that in the Lamrim it's also that there are practices in common, right? So there are practices like, so for example, meditation on impermanence. That's one of the trainings, particularly of the knower basics. It's a training that one does as part of one's practice to achieve individual liberation, but it's in common. Bodhisattvas have to meditate on that also for their own benefit, for their own progress. So you also have to meditate on those topics because they help you to progress, but also to teach others. So it's two. But then another point I just thought was interesting when Ken Shrimshay, my teacher, was explaining this. He made a point. He said another observation, I guess that's been made, is that understanding the first chapter, I'll call it, the exalted knower of all aspects, the mind of a Buddha, is very difficult. And so he made a point. He said, actually, part of what this text does is by studying extensively and in detail how you progress towards achieving the mind of a Buddha, it helps you begin to have a clear sense of what a Buddha would be like. Because we can't actually conceive of the experience of a Buddha. He made that point. He said, the more extensively you study and then also experience, to whatever extent you can, these other things that lead towards that state, and as they get closer and closer to that state, then your comprehension of that state, of what it would be like, becomes more clear. So it's also a method of understanding the result by understanding the paths that lead to that result. So that's another reason. And so then, so those are the three exalted knowers. Those are the first three chapters, I'll call them, or categories. Then the next, there are 8 altogether, right? So that's 3. And the next 4 are called the 4 applications, and they're basically the practices one engages in to progress in realizing those exalted knowers. So they're the various practices that bodhisattvas do. So the first is what is the state or what are those paths? But then what are the practices you do in order to progress on those paths? So the next 4 chapters are 4 things you apply, of applications being things you apply your mind to in order to progress to those things. And then the 8th chapter is more on the resulting truth body, particularly the Dharmakaya. That's the mind of a Buddha. So it goes back, actually, they made a point based on this in the commentaries. They'll say, is that different than the first chapter? No, it's not a different entity. It's the same, but it's describing it in different ways now that you understand all those other things about it. And particularly it's emphasizing not, the resultant truth body, the Dharmakaya. Okay, so that's an overview of the structure of the text. And what we're going to focus on is chapter 4, which is the application and complete aspects. Which more about first. Now that was just an orientation. Oh, and maybe I'll say one more thing, just so I thought it was fun to share, and then I'll. I just thought this part was kind of fun to share. Is so ornament for clear realizations. And I said in Sanskrit, it's Abhi Samaya Alamkara. And I just thought when it's in the text and when she taught it, he went through the title, and I thought it was fun to do that. So I just thought it was briefly. So uh, Abhi means clear, and Samaya means realize, so clear realizations. And so Abhi Samaya is like clear realizations in that title, right? Then Alamkara means ornament, so the ornament, right? And then the full text is called Nama Prajna Paramita Upadesha Shastra. So so it means the Abhisamalankara Nama is named. Like actually similar to English, is the same etymological root, Sanskrit. And then Prajna Paramita, perfection of wisdom. Then Upadesha means instructions, and Shastra means a treatise, like a treatise composed usually by the Indian masters. And a couple of points there I just thought were worth sharing. One is uh, a Shastra is one of the treatises, all the treatises composed by Nagarjuna. And like, so the sutras are text, people, a lot of people know this. A sutra is a text written that was spoken by the Buddha. A Shastra usually refers to a text composed by one of the Indian masters, the early Indian masters of Buddhism, like Nagarjuna or Maitreya or Chandrakirti or Sangha. And in the Buddhist tradition, a Shastra means something that can transform your mind, actually. So a Shastra, we say it's a text, actually, which it is. But actually, the emphasis here is it's a text that can actually transform your mind to protect you from suffering. So that's the meaning. So if it doesn't serve that function, actually, it's kind of funny. Then you might say, well, this is Shastra, but it's not a Shastra for me if it doesn't work. But if you apply it to your mind and train in it, then it should be able to protect you from suffering. And then the other part that I just thought was kind of interesting was they said, well, in what sense is it an ornament? Why do they call it an ornament? And one point that if you remember Ken Rinpoche saying this, he said the Prajna Paramita, right, the mother of all the Buddhas, in one sense is you could say is the most uh, spiritually beautiful thing that exists. So why does it need ornamentation? What does that mean? Like and then he said actually there are two meanings of ornament traditionally. This term alamkara, usually in Sanskrit. One is like one. There are two kinds of ornament. One is like jewels that sort of um, bring one's attention to a certain. If you think of a metaphor, right? If a person is wearing jewels, it brings one's attention to a certain feature of that person. If you're wearing a necklace, it brings people's attention to your neck. If you're wearing earrings, it brings attention to your face. And then, of course, in ancient India, both men and women, I guess America is true now too, but that was also true in India. Time. So it wasn't just uh, so one implication. So again, George made the point. He said, one sense, so the beautifying ornaments are like jewels, right? And that and he made the point, nothing can make the experience of the Prajna Paramita more beautiful than it already is. But the ornament can bring your attention to certain aspects of it. And that's where the 70 topics or the 8 categories, by studying it, it brings your attention to those beautiful aspects. If that makes sense. And then another meaning of ornament in Sanskrit, this alamkara, is like a mirror. Like someone's used, and actually you see that in India sometimes they use mirrors as a form of ornamentation, like in a place. And part of the idea is in a mirror you can see everything, right? You can see all that is reflected. And so that's another meaning here is that the Abhisamalankara is an ornament in the sense of it also, so it's an ornament one way, it's like a jewel ornament that brings your attention to certain aspects of the Paramita. In another sense, it's like a mirror in which you can see the entirety of the Paramita, right? And that you can see it clearly. So it's kind of a beautiful, I just thought that was quite poetic and interesting way to think about this term. And since we're saying ornament for clear relations, I thought I should explain what that means. I thought it was weird. I don't know, there's interesting points there, but okay, so that's that. So now this general point I wanted to make. One thing I'm kind of aware of, and I wanted to kind of raise it because we're going to spend some time on this chapter classes, is there are two different there are two different things that we could that I guess that I can emphasize as we go along. One is, as I kind of just explained, right, it is this hidden meaning, and which gives a lot of information about like stages and categories of the path. And um, and they're all taught in this text in very extensive, detailed ways. And I think explaining some of that is useful because it gives people a sense of actually, on the one hand, it's very important because from a Buddhist perspective, you're just, if you want to, if you say, I want to become a Buddha, actually, we don't really know what that entails usually. We don't, we can say, oh, I want to become a Buddha. If you're Mahayana Buddhist, that's the idea, right? Say, I go for refuge until you may become a Buddha and as fellow sentient beings. And we take refuge in the Buddha. So in one sense, knowing these different categories and details of how somebody progresses to Buddhahood is quite important because it's what you're intending to do, in that sense. And another way I have a little bit of concern, which I think is that if we go into too much detail about that, it can become what for people who are maybe feel like get bored, I guess, because it's quite distant from one's own experience. Most of those levels of it. In other words, if you think about from the beginning of the path all the way to Buddhahood, most of the experiences that are described are things you need to experience eventually, but that are quite far from your current experience. And so one concern I have is like I was trying to think about it. So I'm just sharing that. I was sort of contemplating as I was the series of classes and thinking, on the one hand, it is important. It's quite useful. I think it's interesting and helpful to people to understand how one progresses is Buddhahood. And then from another perspective, I was like, well, people who are there's a danger of people getting bored because it could feel quite distant. It's sort of like, oh, that's not anything I'm close to experiencing for now. So why do I need to know the details of that? So I want to try to balance how much of that to cover and how much detail is not needed for the current, you know, purpose or something. So we'll try to figure that out as we go along. I'm open to feedback, I guess, is one point. And then the second thing I wanted to focus on a little bit that's different than that in a way is people. I mean, at PMT's curriculum, and so you know, Lamazopa Rinpoche was the sort of main leader of correct developing it with other geshes and lamas together, but he was the head of that decision because he was the director of that thing too at the time they created this curriculum. And apparently he said that the main reason why he was suggesting the study of chapter 4 of the Abhisamaya Alankara was for people to study the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. And so he said when it's taught, mainly focus on that or emphasize that. And I was thinking, oh, I get it because some of those are things that it's actually interesting. On the one hand, we unless you realize bodhicitta or on the path, like we can't practice in a fully qualified form because there are experiences that come along. You fully experience them as you progress along the path. But anybody can start practicing. And so I was thinking, oh, that's very much in line with Lama Zoparchi's approach, which was practice oriented. And so those 37 harmonies with enlightenment are things that we can begin practicing right away. And so one thing I want to kind of try, I'm going to do my best, I want to balance is sort of, on the one hand, presenting this kind of overall structure of how bodhisattvas progress. And I don't want to leave that out entirely because one is you want to understand what the text is saying much, know something about that. And also it's good to know. But I think too many details and not so useful to the audience. And then but if we focus, as Lama Zoparchi suggested, mostly on the 37 harmonies of enlightenment, then those are things that also to practice, put into practice in daily life. So I'm trying to, does that make sense? To balance those two and try to think of how to sort of balance doing a bit of both. So that's, I guess, my goal through is to try to successfully balance those two aspects. And maybe, first of all, are there any questions? either from folks here or the folks online, and before I go on, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gone in October. Is there, where can we find that text?
Oh, she should have sent it to you. So email Jan. She had to be somewhere else today, but she'll be back next.
Okay.
But if you email sbc@guyasamaja.org, she can send you. I sent her a bunch of PDFs and she can send them. Oh, and I wanted to say also, this is in my email there, so hopefully she's forwarding it. But so there are a number of PDFs that FPMT has really nicely created that anybody who's studying can get copies of. So if anybody online doesn't have them yet, also email Jan spc@guyasamaja.org.
Listen again, SB.
SPC, like S like Sam, P like Paul, C like Stephen, at guyasamaja.org. And then the other thing I'm going to sort of use some of, and it's not, I mean, those are free, so that you just email them to everybody. The other thing I'm going to rely on a bit is I like the way it discusses the 37 harmonies with enlightenment. There's a book by His Holiness Dalai Lama and Thupten Chodron called "Following in the Buddha's Footsteps," and there are copies here at the center. Lisa Richard bought 10 copies, just so people can get it if they want to. But I'm going to use that some because the Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, covers in nice detail the 37 harmonies with enlightenment, and interestingly he does it nicely using he also does an interesting job, I think, in that text. The 37 harmonies of enlightenment are taught in the Abhisamalamkara and other Mahayana texts, and they're also taught in the Pali Sutras of Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka, and, that are from the Theravadan tradition. And one thing His Holiness does in that book is he goes over each of the 37 harmonies, explaining how it's practiced according to the Abhisamalamkara and the Mahayana tradition, and how it's practiced in the Theravadan tradition, and which are similar, but there are slight differences in emphasis. And he'll sort of explain, in the Theravadan tradition, this is emphasized, and it's not that they're different practices, but they're different texts, and there are slight different emphases. And it's always kind of interestingly say, here's how it's practiced in this tradition, here's how it's practiced in that tradition. So you can see that there, and it's quite interesting. So I think it's a useful book also. So that's another resource.
And we have a question.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead, John.
Oh, me. Yeah, thanks. Um, so I've been trying to understand clearly, the structure of the text, and one geshe that I was listening to online was describing the so-called two charioteers. The first one being Nagarjuna, who taught the explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita, so the focus being on emptiness, and then the other charioteer being Asanga, who taught the so-called implicit or hidden meaning. And as I've understood that, and I'm just scratching the surface now, but that refers to basically, the more detailed description of how we actually practice in order to realize that explicit meaning of emptiness. And one thing I haven't gotten to yet that I've been puzzled by is the use of the term hidden. I'm guessing it means just a fleshing out of the actual practices that lead toward the realization, and that it's not using the term hidden as it's used in Tantra. Or is there some reference here to Tantra?
Good question. Yeah, no. First of all, there's not a reference. It's not referring to tantra in that sense of like there's no reference to hidden as it's used in the term in tantra. So that's not
a bridge, not a real detailed reference.
And one thing I'll say about the hidden aspect. One thing I'll say about the hidden aspect though in the Prajnaparamita is part of what they're getting at is like if you actually read the texts right of the Prajnaparamita, actually literally what they're teaching, most of the words are about emptiness, where it'll say like, for example, there are all these passages where, say things like, like in the Vajrakutta Sutra where I think it's, where it'll say things like, if a bodhisattva were to conceive I'm a great bodhisattva, then they are not a bodhisattva, because they don't, because they don't conceive of a self, they don't conceive of a person, they don't conceive of an intrinsically, so that's clearly directly teaching emptiness, or when it's saying there's no eye, no ears, no nose, no tongue, and so on, that's directly teaching emptiness. But part of the meaning of hidden is that it's not so much that the Buddha doesn't say in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, oh, first you'll go on the first path, then you'll go on the second path, then you go on the third path. He doesn't say that explicitly, but the actual structure of how he explained it fits with and implicitly covers, and that when we covered the Heart Sutra, we did that a bit, right? So it's like it'll say, in the Heart Sutra, that you can actually break up the text, and it's teaching emptiness, but one part of the text is actually what the Bodhisattva experiences on the path of accumulation. Another part of the text is what the Bodhisattva, and even if you think of the meaning, gate, para samgate bodhisoa, the mantra of the taught in the Heart Sutra. The explicit meaning of that is gone beyond, right? Meaning gone beyond self-grasping. But then they say the first gate is path of accumulation. The second gate corresponds to the path of preparation. Para gate is the path of seeing. Para samgate is the path of meditation. And then bodhi is the fifth path, the path of no more learning, enlightenment itself. And that's not explicitly explained. But if you understand, if you read the commentary, then it's explicitly teaching emptiness, but implicitly the very structure of that mantra is implying a progression. And it's like that in the Prajnaparamita Sutras as well. Like if so like sometimes in the commentaries on the Abhisammalamkara, there'll be these things where they'll quote like long sections of a part of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, various sutras. And and if you read the words, it seems like they're explaining emptiness, which they are. But then it'll explain, this first part is correlating to the experience of this kind of level, and this other part is explaining when you progress to this next level. But that's not explicitly explained. So it's hidden or it's implicit in that sense. But it's not like contra. A good question. So it's not that like we're not supposed to explain it, or it's supposed to be hidden only for certain people. It's just that it's not explicitly explained. I would say it's in the structure. It's not, it's in the structure of how the Buddha explained and organized his explanation. Are there other questions? Okay. Yeah, so maybe I don't say one. So I just mentioned this. Maybe I'll just pause there. I don't want to. I'm going to try to do today what I said it would do. So I don't want to go too far into the structure of the paths today, but I'll just say one thing since I already mentioned them, and it's related to the 37 harmonies. And I've mentioned this in previous classes sometimes and so on, but are people generally, like, to what extent are people generally familiar with this idea of the five paths? Right? So path, I mentioned, right, the path of accumulation, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, the path of more learning. That's one of the most fundamental or most basic sort of structurings of the path. And I'll say something too, like those five terms, those five levels of experience apply to the paths. Remember I said earlier there are different paths. There's the path of the bodhisattvas, the path of the cures that lead to arhatship, and the path to pratyeka Buddhahood. And each of those has its own path of accumulation, path of preparation, path of seeing, path of meditation, path of more learning. So that's a general structure to Buddhists. Those five paths, that's what they call them, are a structure that applies to all those different vehicles, those three vehicles. Actually, in those five paths, also, if you study, John, you just asked the question, if you study even in Tantra, which is a subset of mine, there are sections, if you study tantric stages and paths, which we'll do at some point, it's part of the basic program. Even in Tantra, there'll be a section in tantric stages and paths where they'll say, here's how the practice of Tantra correlates to the five paths. So it applies to all the different Buddhist vehicles. And And probably, I think people know this part that the path of seeing is when on any vehicle is when one directly realizes, right? Directly meaning non-conceptually realizes the ultimate nature of reality. So that I'm just giving a general kind of sense of the five paths. And actually, and the path, another point I'll make, because actually then we'll get into the four close placements in mindfulness, is the first path, the path of accumulation, has a beginning point. And it begins if it's a if you're a if you're a bodhisattva, it begins when you um, realize bodhicitta. So it means when bodhicitta becomes effortless, right? So because now we can through effort give an ordinary person through effort can give rise to an experience. They call it sometimes Finstrom call it like an approximation, a kind of facsimile of bodhicitta. But it comes about through a good deal of effort. If you sit in meditation and you think about bodhicitta enough, then you can give some feeling and some experience like that. But then, like, if you're out driving and somebody cuts you off, you may not be feeling bodhicitta. So it's not yet, you haven't yet realized it. It's not spontaneous. So for a bodhisattva, when they give rise to spontaneous bodhicitta, that's the beginning of the path of accumulation. Then, and then people have probably heard this term. That's the first path, and then they progress along that path. There's a small level, a middle level, and a great level. And there comes a point where one achieves what's called the union of calm abiding and special insight. Right? It's shamatha and vipassana. Everybody who studies Buddhism will mention here this term here. Shamatha and vipassana, or calm abiding and special insight. And then first you can give rise to calm abiding individually, but there comes a point where you have to unify those two. So it's called the union of calm abiding and special insight. When a person on the path realizes that union, they've achieved the path of preparation. So that's just two, and then when they realize the nature of reality directly, they achieve the third path of seeing. So that's kind of a beginning explanation of the five paths, right? And then path of meditation is the person repeatedly goes back to that experience of directly realizing the ultimate nature of reality in order to overcome their mental afflictions, right? And gain new qualities in order to progress the Buddha. We'll go into the text goes into a lot more detail about the five paths, and we can cover them another time. But I wanted to give that as a starting point, right, for the structure of the process. But then I'll now go into the 37 harmonies of enlightenment a little bit and start those now. And so the 37 harmonies of enlightenment are first of all, as I said, they're thought, Mahayana and Theravada traditions, practices that everybody has to engage in if you want to progress to enlightenment. There's no exception. And they're each of these 37, they're broken up into 7 categories of practices. And each of those categories is emphasized or fully achieved at a certain level of those 5 paths. That's why I mentioned the 5 paths in relation to these. As you progress through the 5 paths, you become adept at various of these 37 harmonies with enlightenment. And they're harmonies in the sense that they resonate with enlightenment, because they lead you to enlightenment. That they're practices you have to do to progress to enlightenment. And so the first 4 of the 37 harmonies with enlightenment are the 4 close placements of mindfulness. And those you begin on the small level of the path of accumulation. So what does that mean? Actually, I want to pause here. It's kind of funny. That means, if you have, and by the way, if you're practicing, I said, when you realize bodhicitta, you enter the Mahayana path. If you were a practitioner of the vehicle of individual liberation, who's trying to just achieve your own liberation, but not achieve the full Buddhahood for all sentient beings, then it would be when you realize renunciation. So when your main motivation day and night is to achieve liberation from samsara, then you would have entered the path of accumulation of the lesser, the smaller vehicle, that we would call it. So one point I want to make is, so I'm going to assume we're Mahayana. I'm going to use Mahayana as the example here. So one point I want to make is, it's kind of funny. If you haven't yet realized bodhicitta, where it's effortless, then you can't yet fully achieve, right? They're fully achieved on the path of accumulation. So, so you won't fully achieve it yet, but how do you ever get to the path of accumulation? You have to start practicing it now, right? So you start practicing the four foundations of mindfulness actually before you're actually on the path. If that makes sense. And it helps you progress first onto the path, and then you'll fully achieve it on that first level of the path of accumulation. And you'll fully achieve it on the small level. I said there's small, medium, and large. So it's one of the first things you really fully achieve, these four foundations of mindfulness. So they're good practices for us who are not maybe on the path yet to start doing, because they're easier. They're easier than some of the more advanced practices to engage in. And then what did you say? So the four close placements of mindfulness. And it's only in the book, Following the Buddha's Footsteps, addresses this. He says, in the modern world, of course, this term mindfulness has become quite popular, which is good. But we should differentiate. Mindfulness is not, there's a difference between mindfulness and the four close placements of mindfulness. Does that make sense? And if you look at like the research, the scientific research on mindfulness practice, it comes from this. In other words, it's derived from Buddhism. So it comes from the four foundations of mindfulness, but it's not identical to them. And part of that is that if you think about the purpose of mindfulness as it's practiced in sort of popular culture is, it's on apps, right? It's on, you can see it on YouTube, you can do whatever, you can learn about it anywhere. It's good, it's great. But there are various purposes, but the main thing is to relax, it's to calm down, it's to get less anxious. It's sometimes to help manage pain or to not have a new episode of depression. With the research, people who have been depressed, if they practice mindfulness, are less likely to have future episodes of depression. People who have anxiety are less likely to have anxiety. You can decrease your overall stress level. It can improve your immune function, and so on, right? So there are many purposes, just some that might just be to relax more, to have a better quality of life, to have a better immune system, to manage anxiety better, and so on. There are all different reasons why a person would practice mindfulness. Those are different than the reasons for practicing the four close placements of mindfulness. Does that make sense? Just want to clarify that point. And then I'm going to read it. This is like very, when the monks study at the monastery, they debate. So they have to, when you're debating, you have to have a formal definition of a thing, right? And they define a thing in a way that can hold up in debate. So the definition of a close placement of mind, right, is an exalted knower of one who has entered a path. So it means you have to have entered at least the path of accumulation, right? When it says enter the path. So it's an exalted knower of one who has entered a path, included within either mindfulness or wisdom, that meditates on the four bodies, feelings, minds, and phenomena, through examining the specific and general characteristics of each of them. So that's the definition of a close placement. So it's not, you can see it's not the same, right? If you said that's not what, somebody downloads the Calm app, that's not what they're doing. They're not doing that. They're not. So first of all, they're not saying use enter the path and so on, but necessarily. So the four, I'll start with the easiest part. So what are the four, why they call it four, right? And it's listed there. One is mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feelings, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of phenomena are the four things you're mindful of. And those are taught in the sutras, actually, like in the Satipatthana Sutra, for example, it teaches those four subjects of mind. So what does it mean, though, when you're practicing the four foundations of mindfulness? And part of this is it says there, right? It says you're analyzing or examining with wisdom. So one point is, when you're practicing the four foundations, I'll just go back to the kind of actual simple point now. when you're practicing the four foundations of mindfulness, one point is you're looking at your own experience, right? In other words, because form, your body, feelings, mind, and phenomena are what you experience. That makes sense. So you're not, it's grounded in your own direct experience is one point. And where it says with wisdom, right, with mindfulness, actually in this context means you become familiar with the object and then you keep your mind on it, right? So mindfulness means it means keeping the mind or remembering, keeping the mind in awareness of a familiar object. So for example, your own body or your feelings, right? You become familiar with what your feelings are, and then you keep your mind on those. You don't forget them. Keep your mind aware of those. And then wisdom means you analyze them. You come to understand them more deeply. And in this context, you come to understand them in order to progress on the path. That makes sense? So you're not just becoming aware of them for no reason. Um, and so there are various things that you would, as you're practicing the four foundations of mindfulness, or sometimes they call it the four close placements of mindfulness. Um, Part of what you're doing, so you're becoming familiar, for example, with your own body means your physical sensations, right? In parts, it's more complicated. We'll get into that, but or feeling. Let's use feelings as the example. Um, Actually, first I'll quote a common point that's made is actually I'll say it this way: there are various things you're becoming aware of, and we're going to go into more detail next class on this. But one is you're trying to overcome wrong concepts about those things. As Solis mentions here in his text, we conceive the body to be the residence or the place where a self resides, as if I'm here inside my body. But there's no self within the body. But that's one thing you're becoming aware of. The commentaries also say we often also think of our bodies as like pure. But if you actually contemplate your body, right, you notice like feces and all the other pains and things that actually your actual experience of your body. It's not something completely pure, obviously. Uh, we think of the body as pleasurable, which sometimes experiences of pleasure, but there's a lot of pain that goes along with having the body. You become aware of all the qualities of the body, right? That would include suffering. Um, and the same with feelings, right? Someone points out we can see our feelings to be what the self enjoys. We think I'm happy, I'm miserable, I'm not feeling right. And one of the things when you become mindful of your feelings and practice the close placement of mindfulness of feelings, one thing you realize is there is no I, there is no self that's the owner of the feeling. Makes sense? Other things are you realize that feelings give rise to mental afflictions, which give rise to suffering. And that's what I want to actually pause for today a little bit, is to practice, contemplate a little bit on the close placement of mindfulness on feelings. And so what that would mean, right, is first you have to become familiar, right? It's not a mindfulness if you're not familiar with the things. At one point, we study this, if you study the five aggregates, it's in there. That's what this feeling is one of the five aggregates, right? This form, feeling, discrimination, composition, practice, consciousness. So the feeling aggregate, which is what we're being mindful of here, isn't the word feeling in English can have different connotations. Sometimes so sometimes that term in English can have very broad, how are you feeling today? Right? Like you can say, oh, I'm feeling like this about this topic, and I'm feeling like that, and this person, in this context, in the Buddhist context, the aggregate of feeling means pleasurable, painful, or neutral. And those are, and if we studied mind and mental factors, it's said in Buddhism that that's an omnipresent mental factor. So it means you're always feeling either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Uh, and it can be mildly pleasant, unpleasant, or extremely pleasant, unpleasant, or it can just be neutral, right? So there are obviously, if you check your own experience, there are gradations of those feelings, right? You can feel a little uncomfortable, or you can be in terrible pain, for example. But all those are unpleasant feelings, aren't they? So actually, I want to ask, actually, just check in right now, right this moment. If you start to try to become mindful, right, practice the close placement of mindfulness on feeling, are you having a pleasant feeling, an unpleasant feeling, or a neutral feeling? And it changes. But check your own experience. And just to become familiar, this is part, like, this is how we would begin to actually, so you can actually notice, first of all, what's your, which feeling tone. And actually, if you start, keep tracking your feeling tone in the present, one thing you'll notice actually is that sometimes it really does change instant by instant. For example, like if a part of your body is uncomfortable and your attention goes there, that is, a painful feeling. And then if you think suddenly, if your mind, maybe if you keep your mind on that, then there remains an unpleasant feeling. But then if you like think of something, certain topic that makes you happy, then suddenly there's a pleasant feeling. And so actually, if you track your own feeling, one thing you'll notice is that they change, depending on what uh, object your mind is engaged with. Hmm. And just for the purpose of becoming familiar with feelings, when I was going to do something, we'll do something together, which is like um, bring for a moment, bring to mind something that you uh, personally experience as quite pleasant, and, and then notice the feeling. So if your mind engages with a thing, an object, in this case a mental object, that you find pleasant, then notice the feeling, right? That, as you said, it's omnipresent, it's always there. So what feeling arises along with that? Mm. And then notice, and then bring to mind, ready, an object that you find quite unpleasant. An object can mean like it can mean like an actual physical object or a person or a place. You know, an object meaning you're the subject, an object of your mind, right? So could mean another person, could mean a non-human being, could mean a place, could mean a thing. But bring to mind, you know, an object of mind that you find unpleasant, and then notice the actual, just the feeling, right? The unpleasant feeling tone in your own experience. And if you like, you can go back and forth, like between pleasant, you know, between present moment, whatever you're feeling, if you're not particularly focusing on some mental object. But you can also bring to mind pleasant objects, unpleasant objects. And you're just getting to know your own mind, watching how these pleasant and unpleasant feelings arise for you, yourself. And as we investigate that with wisdom, keep doing it, you know, keep experimenting. And then also try to notice in your own experience how there's a feeling of I. I feel pleasant regarding this object. I feel that object's unpleasant. And with wisdom, just analyze for a moment, just your own experience. We're not trying to do some elaborate thing here, right? But is that I the same as the feeling? Or is it the owner of the feeling? Is the feeling somehow inside the I? Is the I inside the feeling? What's the relationship between the pleasant feeling and the I? Does the I grasp at the feelings and as if it's really mine? for a moment, for example, if you bring to mind the object you find unpleasant, for example. So like if you bring to mind an object you find quite unpleasant. And then with this kind of, we're analyzing, right, our own experience. And you see how your eye, your sense of self, either identifies with or takes ownership of or feels it's mine, right? Like, or thinks it's like me, it's part of me. That feeling, that unpleasant feeling. Feel the actual unpleasant feeling itself in relation to your mental object. You see how that eventually gives rise to, in your own experience, to mental affliction. Eventually, as we identify with or take ownership of or grasp at that feeling, it can give rise to anger, hatred, agitation, despair, whatever, some many different kinds of mental affliction, suffering. We stay with our own experience, actually, right? What's happening is that there's awareness and an object of awareness. And with each moment where there's an awareness and an object of awareness, there's a feeling present. It's a natural part of how the mind works. Feelings are sometimes positive, sometimes neutral, and sometimes negative. But it's omnipresent. There's always a feeling tone there. Can you see to some extent how when all of us, when we grasp as the feeling is mine, you give rise to suffering. Actually, there is no owner. Feeling is impermanent. It's dependently arisen, dependent upon the awareness and the object of awareness. Like the sound of two sticks hitting each other. Dependently arisen, temporary, impermanent experience. But I grasp at the feeling as though it's part of me or mine. And I become agitated, angry, the object of feeling. And I compound my own suffering. And part of what we're exploring right now with our own inner exploration, our own wisdom, is how feelings are connected to the cause of suffering of the Four Noble Truths. That I relate, feelings are a natural function of my mind, but I relate to them in a way. So they become part of the cause of suffering. Well, just for a couple more minutes, just again, it's not, and we're be careful, you're not trying to judge yourself, you're not trying to, just trying to check your own experience. Is that true or not? And you can kind of experiment or play with that in relation to different objects of mind. You can do it also with pleasant objects. Right? So there's a pleasant object, make sure like there's an eye that wants to. So you may develop kind of craving or attachment or grasping at the object. So initially you could think of a certain object and there's a pleasant feeling tone. But if the mind gives rise, let's say, to a sense of I who wants to own the feeling, wants to have more of that feeling, then how do you relate to the object? Again, really, there's awareness, an object of awareness, a temporary feeling, like when a striker and a bell hit, it's a sound. It's temporary, it's dependently arisen. But if I see that impermanent feeling as though it should be permanent, I try to grasp at it, hold on to it, make it mine, make it solid, make it permanent. As though there's an I who can own the feeling. And I grasp at the object, thinking I can then have that feeling. check our own experience. First of all, is that true? Your experience. And then what happens? Right? Either you can't get the object and then suffer. Or if you do get the object, of course, it doesn't always give rise to that exact feeling. Those feelings aren't like that. They're not permanent. They're impermanent. And that's something you can own. That's something you can store up and keep. And so you check. How is that? Is it true that the way I relate to feelings, to my own feelings, is part of how I cause my own suffering? Inadvertently. Come back to the other. We're going to take a moment and let's spend the time so people ask questions. Let's catch it together. I wanted to give people a little bit of a sense of, so that, I mean, again, I was, first of all, you saw what I was getting at, right? A little bit covering this kind of stages and past, the 5 stages, but then a little bit the experiential sort of, how do you apply these in practice? And that's, that's not even full practice of the, like close placement of mindfulness, not feelings, but it's just an introduction to that one of 4 those close placements in mindfulness, which was just a little bit introduction. But do you see how like those 4 close placements? I mean, all these things. I hope you're starting to get a sense of something. One point is that these are not like they're practices that are totally integrated with the path, right? Like in other words, you can't practice if you can't practice that, you can't practice the path, right? That's why. Why is it that it's taught? Right? Why is it that it's also at the beginning of the path? Is we have to know our own experience, right? And we have to check, because and also, do you see the connection between that and the 4 noble truths? Actually, these 4 close placements of mindfulness are intimately connected to the 4 noble truths, right? This one, particularly feeling, is connected to the cause of suffering, to that noble truth. And that's what teaching, that's what the teaching says. If you check your own experience of in relation to feelings, you'll start to understand how one causes one's own suffering. You can study the 4 noble truths in terms of like what they say, and that's good. And then this is how you start to contemplate that as you relate what you've studied to your own experience. So for example, one example in relation to your own feelings, you see, oh, how do I, because they say, right, what's the cause of suffering? It's ignorance, and it's the desire and hatred and so on. But here you check your own experience, right? Is that true? How do I relate to my feelings? Am I giving rise to a kind of craving, desire? Am I giving rise to an aversion, a hatred, or an anger? And is that what causes my suffering or not? You keep checking. And that's how you both come to understand. And I want to make one more point. Then you come to understand, if you see that it is the cause of suffering, you understand how you cause your own suffering. That's a huge gift in terms of understanding. And then you can also understand how others give rise to it, which is part of the practice of compassion, right? Because you want to free others from suffering and its causes, but you can't free others from the cause of suffering if you don't understand what the cause of suffering is for yourself, right? And then you see how others might be similar to you. Anyway, so you get my point. This is connected to the entire path, even though it's one practice. But then you have any questions about it?
This may be a language issue, but when you talked about close placement from the meditation you did or the exercise you did, it felt like, for me at least, I was coming in closer to my emotions. So, but I don't know if that's the meaning that close placement means, but it was like, I want to use an overused phrase, but it was being so present with that. So it was right there.
Yeah, and that's part of the point, isn't it? You really want to sort of, make your, yes, I think you're on the right track.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, no, I think that's I mean, we can go into later, like the formal definitions of close placements and all that, but I think just from a very practical perspective, what you're saying is exactly what you want, which is to get sort of to intimately know your own experience and to analyze it again, as it says, with mindfulness and wisdom. And that's the idea here is that you're combining a kind of mindfulness with a kind of wisdom
Right.
that understands your own experience. So is that right track? Other comments or questions, online or but okay. So I'll just say
Oh, we have one.
I want
Go ahead, John. John, go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not catching on here. Um, one thing that occurs to me, when we read the Heart Sutra, for example, and in answer to Shariputra's question, he's advised to investigate the nature of the skandhas, the different parts. So it looks like these four things in this scripture that we're studying are just a different framing of those skandhas, and just kind of collapsing, a couple of the skandhas into mind, and it looks like the goal is the same, to investigate them and to see that their nature is emptiness, and that which is, and to the extent we suffer is just because of the temporary karma that we collected, that's forcing that experience of, for example, pain upon us. So, and then with regard to that exercise that we just did, I was curious because and I don't know the particular Sanskrit that's being translated, but I know in the translation of the Heart Sutra that I've been studying, as opposed to the translation being feeling, the translation is sensation. And my sense of the distinction between those two English terms is that sensation is more of a raw term, whereas when we translate it as feeling, it incorporates more of a conceptual sense, a more of an emotional sense. And so I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that, and if you think that's an important distinction, between sensation and feelings, or if it's intended to be synonymous, within the Buddhist context.
yeah, I think well, first, I think the Sanskrit term is Vedana, that they're translating there, and
And again,
I think I get one thing, and also I think you're very much right. I know you're right about there is the four objects of the four foundations of mindfulness, um, correlate to the five skandhas. You're right. So like, and there's if you think of mindfulness of body, that's form. Mindfulness of feeling is the aggregate of feeling; it's identical. Then mindfulness of mind would be consciousness, but the five kinds of consciousness. And then phenomena, mindfulness of phenomena would capture both discrimination and compositional factors. So because phenomena, there would be mental phenomena and external phenomena, any phenomena that's not one of the others, that's not included in the other objects of mindfulness. So you're right about that. And then going back to the Vedana or feeling, I think the important point, I think is important for all these topics as we get, if when you're first studying Buddhism, I think just getting a general idea is good. But when you're trying to really practice like this, I think it's quite important to actually look at, like you're getting at, because the English terms are always every English term is going to have slightly different connotations from what the Sanskrit would have been. So what becomes really important then is to look at how are they actually defining it, right? Like, so if what we're calling feeling here in this text is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling tone or tone of experience, that's what's important. So there's, because whichever term you use in English, the important thing is to recognize, okay, what we're really getting at is when I engage with this, when my awareness is of this, there's a whatever one object, there's a kind of feeling or an experience that's pleasant. When another moment there's an experience that's unpleasant, another is an experience that's neutral, and it keeps changing. That's what's important. But I think so whichever, then you can actually analyze for yourself, well, which English term does that for me? And in my experience with any of these things, I noticed like sometimes one term is more useful and sometimes another because they get it at different, what's the word, like sometimes I can get like a little ossified in my experience around something by using one term, and then if I try a different term, I'm like, oh wow, okay, it's that. But the important point is to keep going back to how do Buddhists define it, that whatever you're being mindful of. And that's looking at the characteristics of that object, the familiarity with that object. So I think that's the important part. So I actually like that you're looking at different translations. I do the same. I think it's useful. But I think for all of us, it's useful to keep going back to how is it defined in the literature of Buddhism, and then relate that back to one's own experience. What am I then looking at in the experience? Yeah, knowing the sense can help a little bit. But I think it's quite, sometimes I was noticing that in various things that some translators use even kind of idiosyncratic terms, which I wouldn't use all the time, but I sometimes find those idiosyncratic ones are provocative. Like, oh wow, maybe that means, maybe that's getting at this part of my experience of that. Why do they choose that term? And start thinking about it. And as long as you keep going back to the definition that Buddhism's saying to be exploring, those different English terms can be quite useful. I don't know what times we should stop, but anyway, the next I can't remember exactly, but we already have scheduled. The next thing here is that session where we'll talk about different topic, not about this, right? But about people's experience of trying to make the world a better place and how they integrate Dharma with that lens of one of the people, right? Yeah, it's timing for that.
Perfect time.
Wasn't planned that way, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But and then we've already got the next class in this series scheduled, and I'll soon post more classes in this series for I guess it'll be in January. So I'll send those out soon, and you would requested another prayer session. I'll send all that soon. But let's just quickly do the occasion. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it's not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all powerful Chinrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara end. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled totally empty from their own sides. If the I, who is merely labeled totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled totally empty from its own side. May all sentient beings who are merely labeled totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And lastly, may we all, and everybody else, be able to realize, first of all, the explicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita, emptiness. And through that realization and practice, may we be able to progress through the stages and paths taught in the Prajnaparamita by the Buddha, and the hidden meaning or implicit meaning of the Prajnaparamita sutras. And so through any even effort at all at studying or contemplating this, may we all be able to progress on the path that the Buddha explicated here of the perfection of wisdom in order to be of benefit to ourselves and all sentient beings. Thanks, then.
Thanks so much.